turn attention to something that's been on the mind of the scientific persona in me. The ideal of the scientific quest, the grand unified theory. As you probably know, there's currently a rift between subatomic physics and atomic physics. Everything that's bigger than an atom and everything that is smaller than an atom seems to be operating with two very contradictory sets of rules. But the simplicity of our limited computing power is always drawing us to unify what we can, to find integrity in that. Here's some of my thoughts on psychedelics and altered state and ritual. The first thing I think to realize is that the ego consciousness is a lens that can capture a certain amount of data. That in the tableau of multidimensional data on all spectrums and frequencies throughout the entire many multiverses and all their many dimensionalities, that our human ego can capture a very tiny fragment on a very tiny frequency, on a very tiny region of all that is. And this little bit of data, the ego says, is me. And everything else is not me. And it's a useful partition, because if you can imagine, a little eye that can only see at any given moment a very little bit of the data sphere. And if you think of the size of this in comparison to the entire universe, you begin to see just how small this lens is as a lens to assess the data. Now, when you create a small lens in relationship to a large field of data, you invent time. Because if this is the data set and this is the lens, there's no time. You see it all instantly. It is there instantly. There's no time. But all I have to do to invent time is I have to go in to such a very, very small bit on the lens, so that now there's this, 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 now there's this. In other words, I've slowed down the examination of this timeless hand by zooming in. And in doing so, making the eye that is examining it, the camera lens, too small to encompass it all at once at such, close range. And so the ego lens that says I'm this and I'm not everything else is such a tiny lens that when we first look at this and then look at this and then look at this and then look at this, we say, wait a minute, I'm no longer looking at this up here. That's in the past. I haven't yet looked over here. That's in the future. I'm looking here. That's now. And we create time. The ego lens is a very, very tiny lens. And yet it is all that we have. And a lot of the bravado and arrogance comes, I think, from the traumas that remind us just how fragile our egos are, that they can be punctured and broken in a few moments and cease to be, and that anyone can do it. Anyone can put a bullet through our head and bingo, our ego no longer exists. We exist. The part of us that is so much bigger than this tiny lens, that exists. But the illusion of the smallness no longer exists. We're just back in the timeless place where we're not this tiny little thing examining something much bigger and denying everything else. And a lot of what trauma is, etc., it's not us, it's the ego's coping mechanism, trying to survive as a separate identity, to grow, to experience itself through the lens. You could call it an illusion, you could call it real. The reality is that when you take a timeless object like this and you start examining it through a very small lens, you look first here, and then here, and then here, and then here again, you've now created the sequence that is the conscious experience of time. First, second, third, that's time. This is not time. When you see everything in all moments, there's no time. When you see a tiny little bit, and then another tiny little bit, and then another tiny little bit, it creates a narrative out of time. It's magic, it's creating something out of nothing. Time didn't exist until we packed consciousness into such a tiny lens that it seemed as if first this existed, then this existed, then this existed, then this existed, when really it all exists all the time. Now, when it comes to psychedelics, one of the things that they do is dissolve the illusion of the ego. They take our consciousness back outside the little lens through which we are examining small bits of the fabric of reality. And they take us out into the infinite dimensions of being that is present and being in relationship to being. The infinite that is in relationship with the infinite in this timeless space, in this spaceless place, because you also create this sense of space when you move from here to here to here. There just is when you are in all space simultaneously. You're in the tiniest space, you're in the largest space. It just is. And when you just have isness without time, one doesn't feel cramped in this moment and exalted in this moment. That experience is created when you take a very tiny lens and go into a very tiny space, then take the lens and move it over into a very large space. And now you create the awareness of space that didn't exist before you created time to examine it. Time is a lens created by size. Psychedelics lift the lens by overpowering the sensory organs that effectively capture consciousness inside this little lens. Now, what are some of the variables in play from our ego perspective around this? Number one, how sensitive we are. This is one of the variables. If we are in the category that Dr. Elaine Aron calls highly sensitive, in other words, if we are part of the biological segment of mammals that has, throughout history, dealt with a fact of biology and chemistry and physics, that when you rush forward, you create back eddies. If you have a raging river that's rushing downstream and you have it interacting with objects along the side, you will always have parts of the stream that are going uphill. They're going against the main current. Now, this is a source of energy. And in the survival of consciousness, in the survival of animals, etc., it's all about competing to capture, to consume, to partner with enough energy to maintain the illusion of our existence, enough food, enough electricity, enough information, enough money, enough love. It is a competition to capture energy. And what these back eddies create in the physical matrix of reality is they create an opportunity for a dissenting minority. It creates the evolutionary path for the contrarian. If there was no back eddy on the river, the contrarians would be dead. Because if you have a strong energy flow that's flowing downhill, and you say, well, I'm going to bet on going uphill, you're swept downstream. There's no way to win. But because of this biological dynamic, that the stronger the force of the majority of energy that goes this way, the more there is a back eddy for a very small percentage of energy. It's less than 10%. That is going the opposite way. It creates a sustainable basis for a strategy of diversity, contrariness, and the highly sensitive population, roughly 10% of human beings on the planet, are born biologically much more responsive and sensitive than everyone else. Which means that the environments that are optimum on the continuum between boredom and pain, there's a sweet spot for every human being that is engaged and alive without being overwhelming. But for the highly sensitive person, that sweet spot is way lower on the stimulation continuum because that's their niche, in reality. They are one of the dissenting contrarian minorities. that have played a striking role throughout history by being unusually attuned to certain nuances that make all the difference in the world. If you look at the quants, those superpowered investing machines that are making money for hedge fund managers, a company that's based on speed and responsiveness as its primary strategy in investing thousands of times a minute, these little micro trades, every millisecond counts. See, and this is a heaven for a highly responsive sensitive that's focusing their sensitivity in that terrain. And it's so important of a competitive strategy in the money markets. And money is so important in its godlike status in our culture that key traders will not only install fiber optic cable to the stock exchange, but they'll actually move a few miles closer to the stock exchange to shave 1/1,000,000th of a millisecond off of every trade so that they can make it with the quants faster than any other hedge fund out there. And the understanding, the respect for speed and sensitivity, responsiveness, is so high among sophisticated investors that they will pay the $10 million to shave a millisecond off of the speed of every trade in the markets. And it's the sensitive that capitalizes on this dynamic. But it is also the sensitive that is in torture and in pain when overwhelmed, when not respected, when not understood. A quant machine can make billions for a sophisticated investor, and a single glass of water on its wiring can ruin its existence for eternity. It's this paradox of strength and fragility, of power and impotence. The fact that a quant could make billions and a quant cannot get you a glass of water, no matter how much you plead. And the water it can't get for you can ruin its existence. So sensitivity is part of the algorithm in this consciousness exploration, because if you know that your volume setting in a given matrix of responsiveness is 3, 5, 7 times louder than everyone else's, then it takes a third or a seventh of the stimulation to bring you to your peak stimulation threshold. And blasting the data, the impact, the vibration at you at the full dose of a typical human being can destroy you, can overwhelm you, dissociate you, make you dysfunctional, like that water on the quant. So sensitivity in very specific arenas, it needs to be quantified. It needs to be attuned. the difference between dysfunction and excellence. In this realm of sensitivity, the sensitive can achieve and create transcendent states, much more easily, with much less stimulation, can go into those altered states. So we have a map here which consists of where one is on the sensitivity spectrum. You can find out in a few minutes. Highly sensitive person test. Dr. Elaine Aron. We have our personal sensitization to given things. We have trauma, which is part of that personal sensitization. We have trauma, which shatters the ego by flooding more stimulation and more data in than the ego can process. By shattering the ego, we go back in a certain way to the pre-egoic state where we are everything. But to the ego, this is terrifying. This is death. To us, it is a return to who we truly are outside of this little lens, and the ability to dance with who we are as a totality. I mean, it's the most liberating thing, but not for the ego. It takes great love and great compassion for the ego to unwind itself slowly into the matrix from which it was formed without experiencing the trauma of death, of dissolution. Trauma is one of the most important things to understand and resolve prior to working with boundary dissolving experiences, tantric lovemaking, psychedelics, alcohol, extreme stimulation and overwhelm. It's a very, very important part of the mix. So we also have this kind of balance, this balance between boundaries and boundary dissolution. It's one of the matrices that creates consciousness. There's no sensation, there's no sensation, there's no sensation, there's a boundary. And the more I push into this boundary, the more sensation this is. And so as boundarylessness intersects with boundaries, we create consciousness, we learn, we discover, we have new awareness. Now, what's it all about? And I'm not, going to answer that question here. What's it all about? But when we know what it's all about, or when we think we do, and when we start exploring, what it's all about, and we consider this question, when and how to use these technologies of entheogens and boundary dissolving psychedelics. One variable is to understand our sensitivity. Another variable is to understand trauma and to address the unresolved issues of trauma in our own field. One variable is to understand our egoic relationship with all that is. and to transcend the delusions of the human experience. To answer Einstein's question, is the universe a friendly place? The most important question. Because if it is, if the vast field of possibility that's out there is far more friendly than the limited field of human consciousness that we've been exposed to, then journeying out there is truly the most safe and beautiful thing that we can possibly do. But if out there, in our mythology, a mythology populated by the fears and archetypes of human beings throughout history, as that boundary dissolves into the totality of all that is, we may project the horrors of our deepest fears and beliefs onto the open-ended screen of all that is, and feel as if we are entering our worst nightmare. And these are, I think, the terrains to integrate, to balance, to explore. So I want to suggest a path. Number 1, find out if you're highly sensitive. Number 2, read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. 3, take the adverse childhood experiences study as a little bit of a indicator on the probability of reservoirs of human trauma. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, cultivate the beliefs, the mental and psychological architecture that is predisposed to receive help, to ask for help, to feel the presence of an unseen friend, to see through the lens of the mind, through the lens of consciousness, the unseen friends that are all around us, in their presence, their majesty, their grace, their complexity and beauty that transcends language. And in that way prepare for the ripping apart of the biological matrix of the illusion that traps our sense of self into this very small particle through which to see, and explodes our consciousness into an overwhelmingly, and if we have prepared, overwhelmingly beautiful sense of what is. Experiencing the divine, the totality, the complexity, the projection of that which is most beautiful. And it's always a projection within the human mind, most beautiful, out onto that matrix of what is, the chance to interact with the love and the beauty that is out there through the crystallization of our ideals, our principles, our projections of deities. These are the archetypal templates through which the other can engage with who we are. It is the most profound perhaps the most profound and meaningful experience of our lives.